Okay, it's time to keep things in perspective. Only $200 billion of the $787 billion have been spent so far for the stimulus. They gave you no statistics on whatsoever of how the stimulus created or saved jobs. Now, a CBO report came about a couple days ago, and it gave a pretty detailed report on how the stimulus created jobs. Now, for every dollar that the stimulus package spent on infrastructure project, on incentives towards education, the GDP increased $2 to $3. So that's a multiplier effect of almost 3. So for every dollar you spend there, you get a $3 increase in GDP. Now, for every dollar you cut in taxes, the multiplier effect is only 50 cents. So the Republican plan was to just cut taxes for the stimulus. That would have been disastrous. There was even a Forbes article a couple days ago that talked about this. And I think, by the CBO's estimate, around 1.6 million jobs have been created so far because of the stimulus. I mean, these guys know what they're doing. They're not just idiots. They know what saved or created indicates. They know what macroeconomic analysis they have to use to make such a prediction. And he talks about the deficit because of the stimulus. Only 20% of the deficit this year is because of the stimulus. The majority of the deficit that occurred this year, the $1.3 trillion, was because of the bailout that George Bush approved of. And I think that the tax incentives that were given by the stimulus, the CBO reported, were actually the engine that bottomed out the unemployment numbers this recession. I mean, by all accounts, every economist, every sane economist you talk to, they will say that this stimulus has actually helped bottom out this recession. We were supposed to have 13–14% unemployment numbers. Just the other day, the revised numbers were it's less than 10%, almost 9.8%. So it's bottoming out. The economy is bottoming out. It's a bad recession. No one's denying that. The stimulus has helped, and only $200 billion of the stimulus has been enacted so far. So I think it's good to keep things in perspective, not get carried away by just bromides and platitudes. It's important to keep statistics here and make sure that we know about that. So.
Thank you. The next question would be, is it hypocritical for Republicans to denounce the exploding deficit under Obama when the deficit expanded under President Bush?
I'm sorry. It's my turn to do it first. Is it hypocritical? I don't think so, because it's really a matter of degree that, yes, the deficit increased under President Bush and that our debt has been rolling. I'm not going to sit here and argue that was a good thing, but I'm going to say that it was justified to a large extent because we were fighting 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And you can argue the merits of those wars, and we will, but the fact is that national defense is a whole other issue than trying to push through a stimulus bill and cap and trade and healthcare, which it's questionable whether it'll actually help the economy, and it's just a whole other ballpark than national defense. So, and then it's also a matter of numbers, of actual numbers that I don't have the actual numbers in front of me, but the deficits under Bush are nothing compared to when we're looking at 10% deficits under President Obama, 10% of the GDP under Obama. So we have to keep that in perspective. That is it hypocritical? I suppose that some people could say that it is, but you really have to just pay attention to what's happening out there and say that, well, what is this money being spent on? Are we seeing any real growth in the economy from the stimulus bill that the deficit has been spent on? And no, you're talking about GDP, that $1 that you spend is another $3 in increase in GDP. Well, why is our GDP going down? I mean, I know that last quarter it went up a slight amount, but that was mostly because of cash for clunkers. So it's not because of the stimulus bill. And just the government is just spending and spending all of our money, and eventually we're going to have none left, and we're going down a path that's unsustainable. We can't keep going down that way.
You said something about Clash for Clunkers. That was a $2 billion project that can increase the GDP by much. And the GDP increase, by the way, has been attributed to the stimulus. Every economist will agree with that. I mean, there's no debate about this. It's stone cold fact. Okay, the other thing is, yes, it's absolutely hypocritical for them to talk about this. Much of the deficit this year is because of the bailout. Hands down. Every economist will agree with that. And the other thing is, he talked about how the tax cuts that the Bush gave was justified. George Bush is the only president in history to have cut taxes and go to war at the same time. Absolutely disastrous policy. Roosevelt increased taxes to pay for the World War II because he understood that we have to have sacrifices to go to war. No one can just justify a $1 trillion war without having to pay for it. So if George Bush had asked for increase in taxes to go to war, that would have been a fair trade-off. But he didn't. He cut taxes, $1.3 trillion in taxes over 10 years. He cut taxes and he went to war. So it's unjustified. And I think as a Democrat, I'm also worried about the deficit. So I'm not going to sit here and say that the deficit isn't ballooning. But under Roosevelt, we had a deficit, a debt that was 125% of the GDP, and we had a deficit that was 50% of the GDP, I think, in 1937. Yeah. So we had alarming numbers back in World War II. And I think it was much worse then than it is now. And I think President Obama is doing the right thing with the stimulus package. And he's not just going to spend the stimulus and not talk about the deficit next year. In fact, his State of the Union next year is going to be focused on the deficit. So I think it's important to keep things in perspective, that we ride this recession out with the stimulus that we have, and then we talk about the deficit. We just can't judge President Obama's action within less than 1 year of him being president. So, yeah.
I'm not going to be completely judgmental in this particular issue because libertarians haven't won an election ever. So, I mean, in this particular sense, I'm going to say that I don't think it's hypocritical at all. I don't think it's hypocritical in any means. If a Republican was in office, then it wouldn't be hypocritical. And a Democrat's in office, and I don't think it's hypocritical. I think we've had this general attitude from the United States from the last like 60 years of this idea of spend, 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 and I don't think we can actually put anyone to blame for one particular issue. You have past events, the past events that have happened. You can go all the way back to Johnson's Great Society and the Vietnam War, and go even before that into FDR's culture of spending in that particular sense. But I don't think that there's anyone to particularly blame for the deficit. I think it's just this attitude that the government has been giving off that you should go out and you should invest your life away on things that don't really matter, and then come back years later, and then expect the government to essentially help you out. I don't think that, I think what needs to happen is I think there needs to be a general cut in government throughout the entire system. I think as far as the federal government goes, we should be focusing less on departments, on transportation, education. I think there should be more autonomy to lower levels of government. And I think at that particular point, that is the only time you're going to actually limit the deficit that is going on. And I don't think stimuluses will work, and I don't think that worrying about who is to blame in this particular situation is actually going to solve the problem. And I think that that's the only way the deficit can be solved.
Okay, and for our last question in the economic and social questions category, to what extent should the federal government regulate or manage American industries like the automobile industry and the banking industry?
Okay. So I think we've heard a lot about how automobile and banking industry have been bailed out. And I think the banking industry bailout came first, and then the automobile industry came afterward. Let me address the banking industry first. I think the majority of this crisis can be, the financial crisis that happened before can be attributed to both the Federal Reserve because it hiked interest rates, it lowered interest rates back in mid-2004, and also because we had such deregulation in the financial market. It was insane. You had insurance industries that basically can bet whether another company can fail or not. So you had these massive billions and trillions of dollars in derivatives market that went absolutely unregulated. The reason why FDR passed the Glass-Steagall Act was because he learned from the Great Depression that banks cannot go unchecked. So he passed a regulation reform to make sure that we don't have unregulated banks betting and hedging on basically anything that they want. This was, Las Vegas on steroids is what was happening in Wall Street. So I think that what kind of regulation we should have in the banking industry is to make sure that you protect the consumer first. So whether it is protecting homeowners from fraudulent mortgages or protecting them from credit card frauds, or you can't have credit card companies give you 45 pages of disclaimer and tell you that you should read this before you sign it. It's just not right. You can't have fine print stuff in the whatever disclaimer that they give you. So I think it's important to have a reform that protects the consumer first. And when it comes to automobile industry, which came out after the banking industry, I think a lot of people misfired on this. I would have personally let the big three fail, because you couldn't have given $25 billion. You couldn't have justified that. But of course, there's a lot of political concerns when it comes to that. There's a lot of jobs on the line. So the president decided what he had to do, and that's how it turned out.
I think the only answer to, the only answer